Okay, so credit for this year goes to Ariel Rachmanov, who asked at the end of our shiur on Shadal's, what was the title of this year?
It's opposition to philosophical Judaism.
Yes, opposition to philosophical Judaism. Ariel said, what's Shadal's thing? And so I looked at the Hakdama to Bereshis, and there is no Hakdama to Bereshis. There's a translator's Hakdama, but then the translator pointed me to the Hakdama of Shadal to Sefer Yeshayahu, where I guess maybe that was the first thing he wrote. But either way, he writes his 10 foundations for his approach to biblical exegesis, to Tanach interpretation. So we're going to read that. And I wanted to give a preparatory statement here. Okay, so a person might see the title or like hear the shiur and be like, Shadal who? Like, I don't care about Shadal. Even if you don't care about Shadal, the way to read a Hakdama, which I feel like I didn't explicitly say before, is you read it and you think to yourself, okay, what is his method? What is it that I don't do in that method, and why don't I do it? You know, meaning, do I have a shita? Like, are there premises that I'm relying on that like I should examine and that maybe I should do, or that I oppose him on certain philosophical grounds, or like whatever? But like, in other words, our goal is not to understand him. That's not the primary goal. The goal is to understand how to learn Tanakh. He learns Tanakh in one way. We've been conditioned to learn Tanakh another way, and we should treat it like a platform to start thinking about ways to approach Tanakh, even if we don't end up agreeing with him. And you know, like Bruce Lee says, accept what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is essentially your own. Yeah.
So to clarify, you say that we should ask why don't we do what he's doing?
Yeah.
You're saying it's not why don't we do it, like why haven't we started doing this already? You're saying why, like what is our reason for
not doing it, right? Meaning that maybe his reason is not valid, maybe we have a better reason. but if he's doing something different than we are, we should ask why and examine the cause of us not doing it and him doing it, you know? Yeah.
Like I guess
Yeah, sure, yeah.
That's like this fun hobby is that like he's doing it one way, we're doing it a different way, and then like different people just do it different ways.
Yeah.
Like he has a reason why he's doing it the way he's doing it.
Right.
So if you think about what that reason is and whether it's something that we can incorporate.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So we're we're looking at his introduction and his methodology as like more as fellow learners of Tanakh than as students. You know, we're not like disciples of his. We want to learn Tanakh also, and we want to see what he's doing that makes sense. And then if we aren't doing it, then we should do it. And if his predecessors didn't do it, then we should ask, well, why didn't they do it? And you know, and like choose whatever seems to be the best for us. Yeah. The other thing is what you said, Yaakov, that you saw the phrase Hayisod Hashishi, and you're like, oh, that sounds like the Rambam. When I was reading this, because he put this in 10 Yisodos, I had a hard time not thinking about the Rambam. But what I realized was that, you know, the Rambam is doing Yisodei HaTorah. He's doing Yisodei HaMethodology. And even though some of his Yisodei HaMethodology sound like Yisodei HaTorah, we have to think of them in terms of Yisodei HaMethodology. And that's going to be most evident with the first two. Okay, so just keep that in mind. He's not defining Judaism. He's defining the foundations of his approach to interpreting Tanakh. Okay, so without further ado, let's go. Hapirush, oops, I just clicked to zoom in. Hold on just 1 second here. Hapirush is that Asher Anochi Nosein Lifnei Hayom. So this commentary that I'm going to set before you today, Uftar Pirush Shehotesi Laor B'Mesher Shloshim Shana, and the other commentaries that I have produced in the last 30 years. V'achirim shekasavti v'adayin lo ra'u or hadifus, and the other ones that I have written that have not yet seen the light of publishing. Kulam yusadim al asara yisodos ve'elohim. All of them are based on 10 principles, and these are they. Right away, I have an insight. Yeah, what were you going to say?
I was going to say this is not his first work.
It's not his first work, right? Yeah. I guess I erroneously thought that. So I don't know why he published this here, but I think that's an interesting thing, that having Yisodos for your methodology anyway. You know, I feel like that would be a useful exercise to do no matter what your methodology is. You know, like if you have a methodology, let's say like the way I approach Mishlei or the way I approach Tehillim, I don't have a methodology for Chumash. Like articulating Yisodos is a useful exercise. because if it is a real chachma, it should have foundations. And like, I think most people just like look at the words and interpret, you know? Yeah. All right. Yesod Rishon hu mitzius habore. Okay, the first yesod is the existence of the creator. Klomar, meaning to say, shamayim ha'aretz v'chol tava'am, that the heavens and the earth and all of their array, enam kedmonim, they're not eternal. Aval haisa lahaviatan hatzala, their existence has a beginning. V'nivra'u b'ratzon habore shehu chutz lahem v'nivdal mehem, and they were created by the will of the creator, who is external to them and separated from them. Ubara'am b'kavana v'ratzon, he created them with intent and with desire, with will. V'hu levado kadmon u'moshe b'kol, and he alone is eternal and rules over them. So far it does not sound like an interpretive yesod. Sounds like an actual yesod. Okay.
Yeah, also,
right, it sounds like that. Mishu hurgel the philosophia ha mizuyefes shel, who's that name? Spinoza. Someone who has been habituated in the philosophy, the corrupt philosophy of Spinoza and his students. The hirgil atmo lakshov, and has accustomed himself to think sheha'einayim lo na'asu b'kavana lama nireh, that the eyes were not created in order that we can see. I don't really know Spinoza's philosophy there. Apparently he denies like an intelligent designer.
I assume so.
Yeah, right. Machshavotav rechokos kerichut mizrach mimarav. His thoughts are as distant as from east to west. Mimachshavot hanavim, from the thoughts of the Nevi'im, ushar bali Sefer Mikra, and the other authors of the holy books. V'rahu hu shalo rahu hu shiyuchal lahavin divrei al mitasim, and it's improbable for you to understand their words correctly. Klomar, lefi kavanas misha amram, according to the intent of those who said them. Meaning, if you adopt Spinoza, then you can't understand the words of the Nevi'im and the people who authored the works of Tanach. Ish asher kazeh, this kind of guy, Yachshov lases pe'er lekadmonenu, thinks to give glory to our predecessors, but Amro, by saying, I think he means Spinoza. Someone who follows Spinoza thinks that he's giving glory to our ancestors by saying, and I'm also not familiar with what he's about to say, Kishem ben arba osios more al ha-havaya ha-klalis, that the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name, is a reference to existence as a whole, like to reality. V'hu hakel hapoal umispal, he is the God who acts and is acted upon, active v'gam passif, right, active and passive. He is corrupting and confusing, and not explaining. And he is ascribing to our fathers and our Nevi'im and our Chachamim beliefs or ideas that literally are antithetical to our belief. Which myriad thousands of Jews have given their souls for. Okay, so what is he saying here? Like, how is this an interpretive principle? He's clearly anti-Spinoza, but how does that connect to interpreting Tanakh? I mean, he says it goes against the beliefs of our predecessors, but lots of beliefs of philosophers go against our predecessors, and he doesn't include all of them as Yisodos. So like what I mean, and again, we're kind of working in the dark in the sense that he's not bringing examples of where there are nafkaminas, but like, can we think of how would your learning of Tanakh be different if you thought that Yud-Kei Vav-Kei referred to reality per se and a like non-creator reality, like an Aristotelian eternal cause reality, as opposed to a God who's an intelligent designer who created with will? Like, how would your interpretation of Tanakh differ? Yeah.
I think you knock out purpose when you do natural creation.
Right. So how does that? So that affects your view of the universe. How does that affect your view of Tanakh?
I mean, I guess any positive stuff gets awaited. I mean, you have to review.
Right. So what's so bad about that?
What's so bad?
Just to push you to play the devil's advocate.
Anything that's happening. Like,
Why?
like you're gonna look at like, let's say like this expression. You're gonna look at it and say like, reality spoke to Moshe and he decided to make it.
Right, that sounds a little incomprehensible.
Yeah.
Right, but the weird thing is he doesn't put it in terms of relation to Torah. He puts it in relation to the universe. I mean, I agree with you that it sounds like there would have to be implications for the Torah, but he doesn't mention that, you know? And we're kind of speculating here because he doesn't say what the purpose of this is. The only example he gives us is the eye, right? If you say that the eye was that we have eyes not in order that we see.
Because in terms of looking at anything in the universe, you can't think about what its purpose is because that's not. There's no intelligence.
Right. So that's the only conclusion I can come to, which is that the Torah presumes a purpose of things in existence, and if you are viewing existence itself as having a purpose, then there's not going to be any there's not going to be any final cost to anything, but there's not going to be any final cost to the Torah. Like there's not going to be any purpose to the Torah, and in other words, if everything just came about by blind chance or what existed eternally, so then we're not moving in any direction towards any purpose, you know? So I feel like that's why he doesn't talk about the Torah itself, because it's not a problem with the Torah, it's a problem with existence itself. Like if you don't have a purpose or human beings don't have a purpose or like, you know, the humanity doesn't have a purpose, then what is the Torah coming to do? You can't even say the Torah is coming to do something. You know, it's like more fundamental than the Torah itself. You know? Yeah, it's the Yesod Yesod in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Right. There's the Yesod Torah, and then this is like the underlying Yesod of the Torah, that there needs to be a purpose to things. You know, good. It's almost not the good. You know, what idea of the good can you have if everything is again? I don't know Spinoza, but if everything is chance or eternal, you know. So this is consistent with what we read last week, that Shadal holds that any belief in the Torah that is taught is not for the sake of knowledge for its own sake. It's for the sake of promoting justice and righteousness. You know, that if you held that there was no such thing as a purpose to anything in the universe, you can't have an idea of the good. And therefore, the entire purpose of Torah and Judaism is there's no purpose, you know? So you need to have an idea of an intelligent designer for things in order to have like an ethical foundation, which the Torah is building upon. Yeah. Okay. Onward. Okay. Hayesod hasheni hu hahashgacha v'hasachar v'ha'onesh ba'olam hazeh. Interesting, he limits it to olam hazeh. So you need the second yesod is providence and reward and punishment in this world. Mishu hurgo liyachas hatzlachas ha'adam l'siflo u'lacharitzuso. A person who is accustomed to ascribe the human success to his intellect and his diligence. V'lomar kochi v'otim yadi atzal liyazchayel zeh. And to say, my might and the strength of my own hand made me this wealth or the success. B'koch yadi asisi u'v'chachmasi ki nivonasi. With the power of my hand, I did this, and with my intelligence, I understood. It was my because of my intelligence, my understanding. Lo yitachin shehiu sifrei hakodesh muvanim al mitasam, muvanim lo al mitasam. It's not possible for the scriptures to be understood by him correctly. Val yasibehem pirushim rechokim mikavanas kotvehem. He's going to make interpretations that are distant from the intent of those who wrote them. But now again, another example of what we were saying before. Why would the Rambam say you should believe in Schar V'Onesh? Because it's true, right? He is giving a utilitarian reason for why you should believe in Schar V'Onesh as a yesod of his biblical exegesis, which is if you don't believe in Schar V'Onesh, what's going to happen? How's that going to affect your interpretation of Tanach?
Then you say no, Schar V'Onesh.
That's not what he says, though. You would expect that. You would, but see, this is why these are yesodos, meaning there are lots of things that you could say that if you didn't hold by blank, you wouldn't understand blank in the Torah. You know, like if you didn't hold by, I don't know, like
I guess I'm having some more. If you didn't understand Bill's character, you're not going to understand that element in the Torah.
Right.
But like that doesn't make any sense.
Right. Right. If you didn't understand Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah, you're not going to understand what it means when Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe. You know, but he doesn't have that as a yisod. Yeah.
And why can't you say there are certain ideas that are just fundamental to all of Torah?
Right. I mean, I would say that, but is he saying that?
Perhaps.
I don't think so. Look at it again. Someone who's accustomed to ascribe human success to his own intellect and diligence, saying, "My strength and my hand made me this wealth," it will not be possible for him to understand the words of the scriptures correctly, because he will make explanations that are far from the intent of those who wrote them.
There's a ton of started ownership. So.
Yeah, but he doesn't say that. He doesn't even specify that you're going to make mistakes about Skarva Onish.
I just thought he was talking.
I mean, he starts off talking about that. I mean, tell me if this is what he's saying, if you think this is what he's saying. I mean, he says, if you deny Skarva Onesh, you will ascribe successes to yourself, and that will cause you to give spurious explanations. Meaning that you're going, because of your ego, because of the fact that you think that you are great, you're going to give explanations that have nothing to do with the intent of those who wrote them. Meaning he's making this into a thing where like it's going to bias your thinking. That's the nafkamina he identifies. Not you will interpret the instances of Skarva Onish and Hashgacha wrong in the Torah, and not that you will like deny the miracles, which he's going to say later on, but that you will ascribe things to yourself. You'll basically become enamored with your own interpretations of the Torah that have nothing to do with what they actually are.
It's
a weird thing to say to go back to Skarvonis, right? This sounds like more like a purely mitos thing, but he's connecting it to a belief thing, you know?
Would it prove anything you do? Any one of these things, you're going to, if you don't understand Bilam, you're going to give explanations of that Bilam, but
right, but that's a particular cause. This is saying something that's going to be like a systemic problem. That if you're so caught up in your own, I mean, again, we have to see how this is connected to Skarva Onish, but he's saying basically like what I guess what is his conception of denying Skarva Onish, such that it results in this? Meaning, again, unless you disagree with me, undeniably, he's saying that why is this a yesod? So that you don't ascribe things to your own intellect and come up with pirushim that don't match. You know, so why is that the nafkamina of denying Skarva Onish in Olam Hazeh and Hashgacha? Like, I mean, yeah.
I guess if you deny Saronish, then you're gonna come to the conclusion that really like you have control over. I'm not sure.
See, here's the thing, right? Is we see, like in our day, who does this? Like secular academics, right? Secular academics come up with their own interpretations of Torah, and we notice that that these interpretations have nothing to do with what is actually like. They don't actually understand like the foundations of Torah and like what it's built upon, you know. But I wouldn't say that comes from a denial of Skarva Onish. I would say that that's a denial of like other yisodos, you know. But he's saying it comes from fundamentally from a denial of Skarva Onish and Hashgacha. Yeah.
It sounds like maybe this is talking about like God's intervention, or like God acting upon the world, besides for setting up the laws.
Right. I mean, the way he says though is Mishu Hurgul liachas hatzlachas ha'adam l'sifla u'lacharituto. Right. So if you are basically in denial of the fact that without God's involvement, you would not succeed. You're going to become full of yourself and ascribe inordinate credit to your own intellect and effort. Like your intellect never did make a difference, but it couldn't have produced the results. And it's going to manifest itself in the way that you approach Tanach. a hard sell. I mean, I agree with him that it's a bad mita, and I agree that it can make you egotistical, but it's a hard sell that like this is a episode of biblical interpretation, you know?
Yeah, it's like if you're willing to ignore the fact that he seems to be an emphasis on stuff only,
Yeah,
then I'd say it's about God's different like
right.
involvement in
So that I think you're going to see in the next episode. Let's read the next episode and then leave this for now. And if we can come back to it, then that'd be great. But it's to me right now, it's a hard sell. היסוד השלישי הוא המופסים למעלה מן הטבע והנבואה. Okay, you can put those in one. Third yesod is, you see how this is so different than the Rambam and Sefer Yeshayahu, is the miracles that are supernatural and nevuah. Mi shelo yamin shahayu ba'olam b'ratzon habore me'oros shelo k'minhago sha'olam. Someone who does not believe that there exists in the world by the will of the Creator events that are not in line with the nature of the world. Kagon haman she'achlu avasin b'midbar, like the man that our fathers ate in the wilderness. V'shaba'al la'adam hoda me'es Hashem, and that knowledge comes to man from Hashem. See, this is interesting. Different than the Rambam. He seems to classify nevuah as a supernatural phenomenon. Rambam classifies it as a natural phenomenon. Okay, but whatever. And this comes to him in a way where it's clear to the person who got the knowledge that it comes from Hashem, not from the thoughts of his heart. So someone who denies those things, he will corrupt or pervert the words of the Nevi'im. And it will be impossible for him to understand Tanach based on the intent of the authors. And there will be many times when he'll be compelled to ascribe fault to them and to deny their antiquity. Okay, so he's going to give examples. Ledumah, for example. So he's saying basically, if you deny supernatural miracles and nevuah, then you're going to end up ascribing faults to the authors of Tanach and denying their truth.
Let's see an example.
See an example. Ledumah, for example. Bir'oso ki efshar b'shum panim sheyihu avsinu b'dor hamidbar pisayim v'tipshim kol kach lahamin she'achlu b'meshach arba'im shana haman hayorad min hashamayim. So when a person sees that it's impossible that our fathers in the generation of the Midbar were simpletons and fools to the extent that they believed that they ate during the extent of the 40 years the man that came from heaven, and that it fell every day except Shabbos, and to accept upon themselves a divine book, as entirely true, Sifro Moshe, a book of Moshe, which includes this book. If it weren't for the fact that they saw the man and ate it, this person who denies that will be compelled to estrange himself and to find, devious ways to rationalize his kfira, his denial. V'yomar, and he'll say, Ki lo b'dor hamidbar nichtav sefer haTorah, that the book of Torah wasn't written in the generation of the Midbar, aval achar kamadoros, but after many generations. Bizman shekvar nishtapshu hasipurim hakanmonim b'pi hahamon, at a time when the stories of the ancestors were already confused in the mouths of the masses. V'hazavuv na'aseh pil va'avru mipe'el peh, and the fly became an elephant from a game of telephone, right? So what is he making reference to? What do we call this argument? I was thinking, what do we call the argument against this, I guess? In other words, if you claimed that the book of Torah was written at a later generation, not during the time of the Midbar, and like someone convinced Bnei Israel to accept it, and then like over time, whatever the claim was made evolved into the fact that like they ate man for 40 years every day. So this is commonly called the Torah Sinai argument, or the Kuzari principle, right? Which is the idea that you can't forge a mass miracle. And the man, anyone who brings the man as his primary example of more than Sinai?
40 years old.
Say again?
Oh yes, why?
Yeah, who says who? So like we make a big deal of Har Sinai, and the Kuzari makes a big deal of Har Sinai, but there's another Chacham who makes his main proof from the man. Sadigon. So Sadigon makes the biggest proof from the man, I guess because it was a miracle that lasted the longest, and would be impossible. Like, you cannot make up the fact, like, again, like the equivalent, I think I heard this from Rabbi Gottlieb from Orthomeach, that like, if you said that in the year 1600, then all of the streets of America were paved with gold, and every day gold fell on the streets for 40 years, and that's how America built its industrial wealth, and like that's what led to the land of prosperity. Like, no one would accept that story, because if that actually happened, there would be ample evidence and testimony about it, And you're not going to say like, oh, maybe the story began with like someone found a gold nugget, and like over time, it expanded into the miracle that like the streets were paved with gold every day. Like that, he's saying that doesn't happen. That's like a qualitative change, So he's saying like if you were to assume that so there's two possibilities, right? Like, we believe that the man fell for 40 years. So we believe this for thousands of years. So there's only two possibilities as to how we believe that. Either it happened, and that's why we believe it, or it didn't happen, but at some later point, someone convinced a group of people called the Jews that this actually happened. And he's saying it's irrational to assume that this story was introduced later on, because our fathers were not Pisayim v'Tipshim. And it's also impossible to say that it began as something like a zvuv and became a peel, and appealed, right? That it started off as like this small thing, like grew into this whole large thing. Either way, you're going to end up like ascribing tremendous fault to our predecessors, and in order to rationalize your kafira. And he's saying it starts with the kafira, meaning that the only person who would say this is someone who denies the possibility of miracles. Let's finish reading. So too, one who sees that it is not probable to deny the prophecy that when we see Yeshayahu prophesy about the downfall of Bavel and about Cyrus, that he was conquered on the night of Simcha and the Chag. I don't know enough about that. And on the permission that was granted to Israel to return to the land, that was granted by Koresh. So he's going to be quick to like cast aspersions and to deny the prophecies that came through Yeshayahu. He'll say that they were written later on in Bavel at the end of the Galus. Or at the time of the last Nevi'im, So he's basically saying, like, if you walk into Chumash or Nach denying the possibility of miracles or prophecy, you're going to end up corrupting and distorting the actual narrative of the events, and that's going to prevent you from understanding them the way that they were intended to be written. And he's saying it's irrational to do so. He's saying, like, he doesn't make it as full of an argument by Yeshayahu, but by the man, he's saying, like, really, you're going to tell me that there was no man, and that at some later date, someone convinced Bnei Israel that they were sustained in the Midbar for 40 years, every day by man, and they had no food for 40 years? Like, that's insane. That's a denial of rationality. So that's his third premise. This one is much clearer than the first two in the sense that you can see how this will, like, the first two had to do with how you approach Torah. This one has to do with how you're going to interpret particular events in Torah.
I can have a good example.
Sure.
You have to like, if you hold there's no like Americans doesn't hit independent like bend over backwards.
Yeah.
To like explain things. So I met someone to claim that Mount Bechor was an earthquake.
Okay.
And there was like some divine intervention in terms of that it like only killed like exactly the firstborn.
Yeah.
But like Virgil was like struggling to like come up with a way to explain how there was like no miracle
Right.
happened.
Right. It's clearly a bias, right?
Yeah.
The example I heard about the mun, you heard the theory about the mun? That there was a hallucinogenic fungus that grew in the Midbar, and they subsisted on it for 40 years, and they had hallucinations that caused them to hallucinate like God talking and the pillar of fire and all these other things. Really, like, okay, you're going to posit like the existence of this thing that actually sustains you nutritionally, a whole people for that long, and they all somehow had the same hallucinations and didn't realize that it was like, it's just like, it's reaching, you know?
Yeah. But what person has like a hallucinogenic and then doesn't realize, and like, I mean, I can hear a person like that a person would do that.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
But on a mass
on
scale,
that scale, like, you know, like, did everyone like have like a very strict eating schedule?
yeah, 'cause, like, if someone's gonna eat breakfast later, skip breakfast that morning, then, oh, like, look, dad's hallucinating, you know?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you know, like, it's just, and they're gonna have the same hallucinations, like, it's insane, you know?
Yeah, and like I said, people, everyone's not eating.
Right, yeah. Yeah, quite crazy. Okay, now you get more to concrete things. not, I think that's the end of the beliefs, okay? Hayesod ha'revihu ahavas ha'emes, love of truth. V'hu, namely, shetiye tachlis magmasenu, that our main goal should be lahavin amitas kavanas hakosvim, to understand the truth, the true intent of the authors. Okay, this sorry, I'll read the whole thing and then I'll comment. Velotiye b'chadre libenu teshuka limto b'sefer hakodesh siua v'chizuk le'emunos usvaros sheba'u lanu mimakom acher. This is connected to what we did on Thursday. That there should not be in the chambers of our hearts unconscious desire to find in the books, the holy books, a support and a strengthening for beliefs and theories that came to us from outside, from another place. Right, like Greek philosophy or Arabic philosophy. Bein shehu svaras philosophios, whether philosophical opinions, or emunos toranios, mukubalos be'uma, or traditional beliefs that were accepted in the nation. Right. So again, this is Shadal rejecting philosophy and rejecting like midrashic traditions in interpretation of Tanach. Okay. Hamida Zos, this trait, and he called it explicitly Hamida, Mitziusa Yakar Mode b'Mefarshim. It's very rare.
Rejecting the doctrine.
O emunos Toranios, or Torah beliefs, mikubalos b'uma, that are accepted in the nation. Right? For example, I mean, I know he's not one who says this, like his Rebbe or his friend, Rav Reggio, right, who believed that Mordechai was not a tzaddik. So he's saying the only reason, his contention was that the only reason we accept that Mordechai is a tzaddik is because that's what Chazal say. But his argument, if you look at the Psukim, then you wouldn't conclude that. So he wants to interpret it only based on the Psukim to understand the intent of the authors. And that's what we define based on Ibn Ezra and Rabag, that's what Pshat is. Pshat is authorial intent. You know, not looking at the text through some other lens. That's his main thing. That's what makes him a pure, at least allegedly, or in intent, a pure like pashtan, like someone who's like trying to find actual pshat. Yeah.
What about the idea of social that? That's the parish, that's what you said.
So I don't know what his view of Torah Sheba'al Peh is, but the Rambam definitely holds that Torah Sheba'al Peh is the halachic parish of Torah Sheba'al Tzav. Not Agada. Yeah, Agada is not handed down at Sinai. Now, there are going to be things where your understanding of Torah Sheba'al Peh will give you an intuition for how to interpret things. You know, let's say, for example, the halachot in Sefer Kedusha of kashrus and nida and Yisur Bia, you know, that's going to give you a certain intuition of what Kedusha is. Therefore, when you see like the word kadosh, it's not going to be derived exclusively from the Torah Sheba'al. It'll be derived from the Torah Sheba'al as interpreted through the halachic lens of Torah Sheba'al Peh. But the key point is not through the agadic lens of Torah Sheba'al, of what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh. Agada is a separate.
So there's no agada that comes from the Torah. That's a.
So I don't want to put words in his mouth in that sense, but I would suspect that he defaults to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So he's saying Mitziusa Yakar Me'od b'Mefarshim. This Mida is very rare in the Mefarshim. V'hi b'Madrega Rama. This is found in the very high level of Rashi Zal. Uveven Bito Rashbam. So he singles out Rashi and the son of his daughter Rashbam. Even though they clung with a full heart to the words of our sages, they did not refrain from explaining the Pesukim based on their pshat. Okay, so I take it back. He's saying even in terms of going against the Torah Sheba'al Peh halacha. We're going Rashi b'Shemos Chaf Gimel Beis v'Rashbam b'Sif the Sefer Vayikra Zayin Yud Ches. I don't want to look that up now because I don't want to get sidetracked. But we did see in the Rashbam when we went through his Hakdama, there's a thing he called the Omek Hapshat, right? There's the Pshat, which is the Psukim in line with Torah Shabbat Peh, and then the Omek Hapshat is if you just look at the Psukim on their own, without the halacha. So that's what he's advocating here. Yeah.
I don't really get how you do this, because if you're not taking anything from the Torah or from philosophy, nothing external, how do you know what some big puzzle is? And there's
Right.
tons of big stuff.
Yeah. So the only evidence you're going to be using, you're going to be drawing from 3 sources. So you're going to be drawing from Hebrew grammar, which he's going to talk about. You're going to be drawing from elsewhere in Torah V'Tzav, and you're going to be drawing from your own mind. You know, and again, he's just to clarify his view, so you don't think he's a kofir. He would not say that you actually, interpret halacha on that basis. That would make him a Karaite, But he's saying when it comes to understanding Tanakh, that's what you do. And again, this is consistent also with the Rashbam and the Ibn Ezra, that they would say like, okay, if we have a Masorah, then this is how we're supposed to interpret it. But when it says eye for an eye, what is it actually saying independently of Torah Shabbat Peh, Like why does the Torah express that you should like lose your eye if you knock out someone else's eye, So he says, so yeah, and is it speculative? Yeah, it is speculative. It's not like Torah Shabbat Peh where it gives you an exact interpretation, but that's true of all of Tanakh interpretation. Let's say like if you're interpreting areas of Tanakh that have no Torah Shabbat Peh, like the Avos. So you are left to your own theories based on the language, your other evidence in Torah Shabbat in your mind.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the Rashi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Optimal base. That must be in Kisisa?
Mishpatim.
Oh, Mishpatim, okay. What is it?
Pasuk is Lucy here Achre Rabin Laros, the Luz Ta'ane Ariv Lintot Achre Rabin Lahatos.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a long Rashi.
Oh, is it? Do we not
It's not.
okay, let's not do that then. Okay. Hayesod Hachamithi. So basically what this is like what we would call intellectual honesty as a midah, but he's saying that in order to be intellectually honest, you have to look at the words themselves to try to get the authorial intent without any preconceived notions, whether from philosophy or from tradition. And this is what puts it in the class of what I call the radical shot school of just the words and their intent. Now, there is one more source that he's going to say. Again, that's the next episode. Okay.
You think
Shadal, yeah. Hayesod HaChamishi hu latseis mimakomenu umizmanenu. Time travel, right? Is that we have to depart from our place and our times. Ulahavi atzmenu bizman hakusvim uvimakomam, and to put ourselves into the time of the writers and their place. We certainly can't do this perfectly. Aval, however, but it's possible to a certain extent. But in any event, the commentator must not intend to find favor in the eyes of his contemporaries, and to acquire for himself praise and glory, and to find many buyers for his books. Even if it's not his intent, and even if he doesn't, this will bring him, even if it's not his intent, even if he does not abstain from loving the truth, it'll bring him to corrupt the words of the predecessors, and to bring them to the what do you call it, the customs of the later sages. So this was his Muslim message at the end of the shiur on Thursday, that be careful not to be seduced by the scholars and of your generation and the philosophers and the philosophical trends, and to project contemporary beliefs onto the times of Tanakh. You should look at the times of Tanakh to the extent possible through the framework that was available to them, not to project your current views onto them. And that's important. I mean, it's going to open up one avenue, though, that is not based on the words of the Pshat. Like, what tool would you use in order to be successful in this episode? History, right? History literary analysis, like Joshua Berman, like he's one who really does this, is like looking at the psukim in their Near Eastern context, not projecting current literary conventions and values onto them, So it's the fourth Yisod made it sound like all we need to look at is the words. But then fifth Yisod says, okay, but you can't look at the words because you're biased from your own times. You need to try to get out of your times and put yourself into the shoes back then. In order to do that, or not in order to do that, you'll be better able to do that based on understanding like their times. And this is, as a side commentary, this is why I have a hard time learning Nevi'im, because the Nevi'im were talking to specific audiences. And I'm not talking about like as much about like the Nevi'im Rishonim. Like Sefer Malachim and Shmuel and stuff are like stories that's much more closer to Tanach. I'm talking about when Yirmiyahu is giving prophecy to his people, or Obadiah is giving prophecy to Edom, how can we possibly understand that without understanding what Edom's culture was like, or like what Bnei Israel were like back then, and like why he talked to them in that way? I just find like it's a closed book, because we're going to project our own values onto that, and like, I hold by the fifth Yisod, but I can't do anything about it. Like I feel paralyzed, And he's not saying you can't get anything out of it with that. It's just that like, it'd be the same thing. Like when you read if you read a British treatise on respect from the 1800s, and you're an American in 2021, like there are certain assumptions and tones and like societal, contextual facts that like are going to make you like think that it's bizarre unless you put yourself in the mind of that like 18th century like person, Yeah.
I say the one mitigating factor is that it tended to be the door. Like, but it's not going to be like intrinsically incomprehensible.
No, it's not incomprehensible, right?
It's gonna be,
meaning it's going to have content that's relevant to the Doros, but that doesn't mean that you're fully unpacking the content as it was intended. Like the example that Berman brings, I mean, I thought of this before I read it in Berman, just to give B'Shem Omer to me, but Berman echoes it. So like, and he's more of a historian than I am. So I'm stacking. Yeah, I'm validated by him. It's like the Ralbag, gives interpretation why are Vayaka and Pekude so elaborate in their detailed account of like the Mishkan when we already went through everything in Truma and Tetzaveh, So he says, Ralbag says the style back then was to be very, very elaborate in describing like these like materially like ornate things, and that the readers of the Torah would be interested in that. Similarly, the Rambam says, why go through all of these like long genealogies? He says, because it bolsters conviction in the truth of the Torah, because that's the derech of like of true accounts, And you see, if you look at the mythology back then, mythology was always not set in any particular time, not set with any particular people, not set with like facts. So if if the Torah is aimed at these people and trying to convince people that this is true, not to convince them it's true, but to bolster belief in its reality, it would go into detailed genealogies and like trivial facts, because that was the style that reflected reality. Whereas if it spoke in a like mythical era, it wouldn't seem as true. So Rambam and Ralbag are saying that that's why the Torah went out of its way to do that. And maybe now, like nowadays, if the Torah were given now, it wouldn't do that, because that's not our literary convention. And we have like J.R.R. Tolkien, who goes onto completely detailed like scenarios with lots and lots of facts that aren't facts in order to make the fictional world more real. So like it might not, relate at this time. So this is the hard one. Okay, Hayesod Hashishi, who oh, this is another hard one. This one's attainable, but I feel like the ship has sailed for me. Maybe there's still hope for you. Hayesod Hashishi, who Hergel B'Sefer Yisrael HaKadmoni Uv'Ksiva B'Lashon HaKodesh. So the sixth Yisod is being habituated in the early Israelite books and in the writing in Lashon HaKodesh. Okay, Ki ribui hakriya v'ksiva b'shar lashonos sogeres ba'adenu havanas hadibur ha'ivri. Excessive reading and writing in other languages closes to us the understanding of Hebrew language. So this is a machlokus among linguists, right? Is that how universal is language? Is language something that meaning is completely transferable, or are there shades of meaning and ways of thinking that are like intrinsic to languages. That if you were born and raised in a certain culture speaking a certain language, you're going to think in different ways than someone else. And even if you learn someone else's language, you're not going to be able to like artificially make yourself think that way. So he seems to hold by that. Hebrew is sometimes very concise and concealed. And it follows the natural path of speech that comes from the innards of the heart. Rashi, from this it follows that our sages, and after them Rashi, they were successful in understanding a certain psukim that many great sages erred after them. This is because the Rishonim, the majority of their involvement from birth and from the womb was in the books of Lashon HaKodesh. V'oznam tivchan hadibur ha'ivri. Their ear could discern the Hebrew language. V'liba margish hamachuvan bo. And their heart could sense what was intended in it. Af im pshat hamilos lo yoreh kain. Even if the pshat of the words don't indicate this. Okay, so again, you see Shadal starting off as this, this is the pshat, but you need historical context, you need a sensitivity to the subjective elements of the Hebrew language, which I don't disagree with that. Like, I do agree that language has nuances that you can't like define based on rules. Like, I'm an English speaker. Like, sometimes you can tell like that someone doesn't mean something that they say. There's a certain tone or connotation or context that you just can't like formulate rules about. And he's saying that about Hebrew. I believe that. So he says that it's known for all languages that it's not always the literal meaning of the word that's intended in the statement. And there are certain figures of speech that their meaning is not like they would seem. And certain omissions that are accustomed in the language. Either the ones that are spelled out explicitly in the books of the grammatical scholars. But we don't have any real authoritative books on the wisdom of the Hebrew language. At a time when Lashon HaKodesh was the spoken language, meaning we have obviously the Hebrew books later, but not when it was spoken. So many of its ways are not clear in the books of the grammarians. I'm going to finish the paragraph. They sensed the language based on their habits, based on the habituation. For example, Eliyahu Amar, Aneni Hashem Aneni, V'yadu ha'am hazeh ki ata Hashem Elokim, V'ata hasebosa es libam achoranis. Okay, so I don't know if I'm going to translate this correctly because I haven't read what he said yet. Answer me, Hashem, answer me, and know that this people should know that you are Hashem, God. You turned their heart backwards. There are many Mefarshim who like, I guess, beat themselves up trying to figure out you turn their hearts. They didn't realize that the language is concise. The intent, if you don't answer me, then you are the one who caused their heart to be blocked from you, to recoil from you. Because I've already said that the one who answers in fire is God. Our predecessors sensed this, and they said, if you don't answer. Then I too will deny and say that you were the one who turned their heart backwards. Okay, fine. So that's just saying that if you just looked at the plain words of the Psukim, you're confronted with the problem because it sounds like it's saying God made their heart go backwards. And he's saying if you really understood connotations and such, you would get this. I don't know if this is the best example because I feel like you could figure this out if you really thought about it. I feel like he explained it to us, but I feel like maybe we could have come up with that if we read it. I don't feel like you need like this sense of Hebrew nuances,
Although it's like a sense of like literary style.
Yeah, literary style. That's good. That's a good way to say it, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I have an example of
Sure.
Of how you if you don't understand like I have an example of how you can't just necessarily get something from the word.
Yeah.
So there's an expression in the Gemara Megillah.
I know what you're gonna say.
No, you know.
Oh, I don't. Okay.
Like I remember the expression in English. I have no idea what it means.
Mhm.
It's a goose soup, but its eyes peer apart.
That's a good one. A goose soups. That's really funny. Yeah, right.
And like I can like maybe guess at what it means. I just have no idea. And,
Right.
like you just like you can't just like necessarily like intuit it.
Yeah.
Like
So my examples that I can relate to, and I don't have any to quote, is from the book of Shalom HaMelech, of Mishlei, Koheles, and Shir Shirim. I feel like we've encountered in Mishlei and in Koheles, and then Shir Shirim is just entirely this. Lots and lots of weird phrases that just make no sense when you read them straight, and like you got to assume that it was just poetical convention. And I'm sure there's stuff in Tehillim like this also. I just don't know examples. Yeah, and it sounds like he's saying though that like the best you can do, and he's gonna support this later on by an anecdote, that like the best you can do is just habituate yourself in reading Bible, right? I mean, like biblical Hebrew, like that's the era of the people who wrote it, who knew what the language was, and even though that spanned lots of eras, I mean, like Moshe Rabbeinu was very far away from Haggai, but like he's assuming that there's a certain common core of Hebrew language. And I guess like the next closest you could do is, and I assume he'd be in favor of this, is, etymology has taken great strides now in terms of like uncovering ancient languages and seeing like the relationships between like Hebrew and Aramaic and other stuff like that, and like linguistic evidence, that we can use to like piece together things, how words evolved and the shorashim and stuff. I would assume that he would say is like a way to get back to the original language. He would not approve of using modern Hebrew to figure out Lashon Kodesh from Torah. Yeah. Okay. Hayesod HaShavi'i hu lahami ka'iyun b'ta'amei hamikras, to go very deep in analysis of the trope.
Oh no.
What?
Oh no.
Yeah. Ki ha'ta'amim hem hakriya hamakubelas pe el pe ad chachmei bayesheni. I think it goes ad bayesheni. Right? Because I was under the impression that this is like all the way back, but I don't know anything about the Tamim. He's saying that the Tamim are the accepted reading Pel Peh, Torah Peh, back to the stages of the Second Temple.
but I thought he doesn't hold by the the parish of the some of
Yeah, right. Why is this not a parish?
Yeah.
I get these things parish is different than reading. Punctuation is obviously it can affect your interpretation, but he's saying that in a language where the punctuation is all bal peh, then the most you can do is see how have people read this. It'd be analogous to like if we found, bad example, if you found like an original Shakespeare that had punctuation in different places, you would assume that that's the authoritative reading, not like later generations. Yeah. Shinu mikra sofrim ukrian velo ksivasan uksivin velo kriyin. So basically, they established all the Greek sieves. All right. V'hem vaday hayu margishim tahaluchas halashon yoser mimeno. So he's saying that this is like an outgrowth from the fact that they understood the language better than we do.
Wait, do you think Bajini they established Greek thieves?
That's what it sounds like. Yeah. I mean, Ezra did that, right? I'm pretty sure Ezra did that. The Greek sieves. Like he's the one. Yeah, Ezra and Ashkenaz Gedola finalized the form of Tanach that we have with all the Greek sieves. And let's say like we go with the Abravanel's theory that like Yirmiyahu was bad at spelling. Like Ezra's the one who made all the corrections. I think though that there might be an exception for Chumash though, because Chumash was Mipi Avura. Were you not there when I said that?
No.
Oh yeah. So quick theory is that the Abravanel says that there's three types of Greek sieves. There's the ones that are teaching an idea. Then there are the ones that are euphemisms, like Basachorim Uba Apolim, or like calling all the Na'aras in the Chumash, like writing them as Na'ar, like Lashon Naki. And then the other one is like misspellings. So he says that in Chumash, then all of which was Mipi Avura word for word, those are all either alluding to other ideas, like let's say like the Shem Havaya, Yukei Vavke and Adar Shem, that's Greek Siv, or they're euphemisms. But then in the other Nevi'im, where the Nevi'im were not given word for word versions of their nevuah, like they wrote it down. They got the content, but then they wrote it down in their own way. Then the language was up to them. And he compares Yeshayahu Hanavi, who was raised with the best tutors and was raised in royalty, that there are very few grammatical pre-ksivs. And then he says, if you look at Yirmiyahu, who wrote Sefer Yeshayahu, Sefer Malachim, and Eicha, filled with spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, like single, plural, Zachar Nekeva stuff. And he says, why is that? Because Yirmiyahu was like 15, and he like never completed his education. So he was he had intellectual and ethical perfection to get nevuah, but he didn't know how to write. And he says, if you do like a statistical count, you find that there are tons of mistakes in Yirmiyahu and very few in Yeshayahu. And like, that's his theory about so Ezra came along and like corrected all the mistakes. And the reason why he made it pre-ksiv instead of just overriding it is because maybe Yirmiyahu intended for an idea, like maybe it wasn't a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very like academic sounding theory.
Yeah.
But like that's a Bravanel, Yeah. Okay, so now he says, "V'hem vade hayom margishim." Oh, so they certainly knew the ways of the language better than we do. We certainly see that they did their work with great precision and great chachma. Oh, so this is the cute thing. So the Shadal calls his commentary Hamishtadel, the striver, right? With the acronym of Shadal. I'll say that for Isaac because he would like it.
Yeah.
Shadal's commentary is called Hamishtadel, right? After his acronym. Barak Bali Hatamim Hevinu Milas Lemino Al Mitasa. Again, I don't know what he's referring to there. That's an example. Yeah.
So why does this not violate his earlier?
About like relying on tradition?
Yeah.
So I'm saying that I think he would say traditional explanations were theories that they came up with, but traditional ways of reading the words were part of the authorial intent.
It sounds like you're saying for some of this they conceded it, they made it up. It was good making up, but they made it up. I mean, yeah, I see how that's in the words. That's a good question. So maybe he's saying then that so I'll stick with the distinction I made, but I'll say that like Bai Sheni was the last authoritative body of people who spoke Lashon HaKodesh and knew the Chachmas HaDikduk to be able to make authoritative judgments on this. But then once the Bai Sheni ended and we were put into Galus, then Hebrew was no longer the spoken language and we lost touch with all those things. Like later on, it's our own speculation for how to read the stuff, but the Chachmei Bai Sheni knew Dikduk. Yeah. I guess it's so valid because once you introduce the idea that there are people with tremendous expertise, therefore it's changed the life of them. Maybe Chazal tremendous expertise in being Farsh.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I'd say we have an injunction to learn this and understand it, and to do it, we have to apply our minds to it, and that's in an area where they're not making an authoritative statement, they're just applying their mind to it, then like we have an obligation to I think he would say that we have an obligation to think about it for ourselves and apply our mind to it. And so relying on authority is not is not like an application of our mind to it.
So what about this stuff then?
Well, here they're making a statement of fact about how the Hebrew language is structured.
Okay.
Yeah, it is an interesting distinction. I mean, I hear what Yago was asking though, is like ultimately though, they are relying on their Chachmas HaDikduk, and even though they're applying it to matters of fact, like they're still relying on their Chachma. So why wouldn't we rely on their Chachma in another area? Yeah. See, this is why it's much easier if you assume that the Talmud came from Sinai, because then that's actual Masorah. Then we would say that we're relying on the Masorah of Torah V'Tzav, and there's no Masorah of Agadata. The words came from Moshe, and Moshe parsed them in this way, and
Did people hold that way?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I always assumed until I didn't read this, So but I guess I'll have to see. I have to go in 10 minutes with 15 pushing it if I run home, because I have to give another shiur at home. So let's try to finish the last 3 sodas.
Okay, just I know we're not gonna finish the whole thing, but
Alright.
Hayesod Hashmini, this is probably the hardest one to know if you've gotten right. Okay, Hayesod Hashmini, V'shirei Kodesh of Melitzos and Nevi'im. So in the song, the holy songs and the poetry of the Nevi'im, Karav Milvad She'i Hamafarish Bal Nefesh Shiriyis. You need to have a poetic soul. The Mepharsh needs to have a poetic spirit. Okay. The open She'i Mukhshar Lihikanis B'Pnimius Rayone Hamashorim V'Hanavim, to the point where he's qualified to enter into the inner thoughts of the singers and the Nevi'im, the poets and the Nevi'im. Ulahavin hadvarim shelo nichtavo, and to understand things that were not written. Hayu b'machshavas hamashor, but to understand what was in the thoughts of the poet. Aval hatikuna hashiriyis hazos sarashiti tivitz. However, this poetic quality must be natural. O knuya mitok shiri hamikra, or acquired from the poetry of scripture. Lo mitok shiri yavan baromi, not based on Greek and Roman poetry. Because the two are very different. He quotes an example of Adoni Avi Zal Chorish Eitzim. I guess like a simple man, right? Chorish Eitzim, like a plow. I guess. I mean, a plower of
Plowed wood?
plow. You don't plow wood though. I would say like maybe a woodworker. I don't know. Umiyamav Lo Kara. Can you get those two names?
Virgil.
Yep, Homer and Virgil, right? So he never read any Homer and Virgil. That's the Greek and Roman poet. V'haya koreh b'Tanach b'chol yom. He read Tanach every day. Hitzliach lihikanos b'machshavas Yaakov Avinu b'shash amar lishuascha kivisi ad Hashem. So he merited he succeeded in entering into the thoughts of Yaakov Avinu when he said lishuascha kivisi Hashem. V'harambaman Mendelssohn. Shehemik hachakira b'shir ha'umos. So Mendelssohn, who went into depth in the songs of the nations, B'kasa mamar nechbat al niskav, and he wrote this very lofty document on this lofty matter. Lo hitzilach harbe b'havanos mikras hastusumim asher b'sefer Tehillim. He didn't understand the hidden things in Tehillim. Gam lo hitzilach liros ulavin ki hashir ha'ivri hu chofshi legamre mikol mini mida umishkal. I assume this means that he didn't succeed in understanding and seeing and understanding that that Hebrew poetry is entirely free of measure and meter, right? Unlike meter poetry of let's say Shakespeare. V'nipte achrei Reb Azaria bal ha'mor einayim v'kibo v'chidik svaraso asher chashav kishire kadmoninu hayu gam hem shkulim v'imlo hayu shomrim hashivui b'mispar tenuotehem kishire yavan baromi mikol makom hayu shomrim k'tzas shivui b'mispar tevotehem. Okay, fine. So he basically is trying to project a Roman or Greek meter-based poetry onto the Hebrew scripture and coming up with a theory, but it didn't play out according to Shadal. This is bottle from its root. Kasher who hopachti b'sefer Orient b'tchilas shanas Lieberblatt des 1840 Orient 1, 2, 20 through 21. yeah. So I guess he wrote about that.
Mendelssohn was the guy who
started reform.
Yeah.
Okay, so you gotta have a poetic soul. So again, what I'm getting from this so far is you gotta go only pshat, but you gotta know Hebrew. You gotta go into their time, get their history. You gotta have a poetic soul. You gotta have a sense of lashon hakodesh.
Yeah, sense of Hebrew, sense of
poetry. Yeah, right. Because it starts off sounding very objective and analytical and scientific, and just being very, very artistic.
Well, I guess he's highlighting different areas of different aspects of understanding a text that's written for people to know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with his with what he's saying. I'm just saying it's much more complex than it initially seemed.
Yeah.
Hayesod hachihu ki pirushe chachminu zal v'gam hatirgum v'hatanuos v'hata'amim enam tamid raya al ma shahaya ladatam pirsha mikras. Okay, this is the point that Avram and Rambam said. So that the explanations of Chazal and the translations and the tenuos, I don't know how to translate tenuos grammatically and literally movements, and the ta'amim are not always a proof of their opinion of the explanation of the psukim. Okay, ki kama pa'amim befirushehem uvetargumam uvekriya betenuos uta'amim. Tenuos are like the vowels. So many times in their explanations and their translations and the reading of the vowels and in the tamim that they give us bal peh, they deviated from what they knew. What they intended was the essential implication of the pasuk. He wrote a book on Onkelos called Ohev Ger. And Avram ben Rama made the same point, that Onkelos will sometimes, in areas where the pshat is obvious, Onkelos will incorporate midrashic elements into his targum, not because he holds that's the pshat, but because he could work in another idea. Or another example from Onkelos is like the Bereshis. So the Ta'amim say, Vaya Adam ke'achad mimenu asnafta ladas tovara, and Onkelos translates it as man has become one, asnafta, mimenu ladas tovara. So he like shifts from the ta'amim, so he's showing that the targum is not like, or the targum is shifting from the ta'amim. B'kasher tira kov akov b'perish Yeshayahu l'inyan targum yonasan u'linyan hanukuz hatamim. And that's what the Ralbag said, is that don't think that when Chazal explain the Pesukim, not all of their agaritas are intended as explanations. Many of them are intended, like they know that this is not the pshat, but they're giving some other idea, So I mean that's interpretive. That's a good interpretive idea that we've encountered before in this year. Vayisod ha'asiri hu ki sifrei hakodesh nishmru tamid b'kerev Yisrael ki segula yakar v'chamuda. You should know is to know that the scriptures have been preserved continually in the midst of Israel like a precious dear treasure. Olam lo nishlocha b'hem yad l'zayfam l'hosif l'gror mehem. And no one has ever edited them in a counterfeit way or added or taken away from them. This is like the integrity of the text. But nevertheless, you're going to find some different nuskaos, and that we know factually, right? Like Psuadaka. Sha'achas mehen hi hanachona asher yatsa mitachas yedei ba'al sefer v'hacheres ina ela shigagas sofer hamati. Right, so there's certain scriptural errors in our versions of Torah V'Tzav. They're very, very few and far between. Some between between different versions of Torah V'Tzav, some between the Torah V'Peh and Torah V'Tzav. Rebbe in his Shavuot here goes into this, and then he says this is much more common in the early days, when the books were not published all in one shot. There are a lot of Sfarim in Israel. Anyone who wanted to would write a new book. Everyone was involved in the book of Torah Moshe. But all the other books, they would read how they wanted. A lot of the early books were lost. When the Chachmei Yisrael saw that the ways of the Greeks were spreading out in the nation, and to destroy their midos, ki amnam Antiochus lo midlibo hisor levakish shiazu Yisrael estorasam, about shnei echav shel kohen gadol yazun minelaos uktaf peritim hanilvim aleim sha'alu mimenu lahavi b'kerev amam min hagi ha'yivanim. Okay, fine. So he's saying it's not Antiochus' fault. It's his two brothers. They wanted to stand in the breach. So the Chachamim gathered together all of the books that were found before Israel became assimilated to the Greeks. They called those books Sifrei HaKodesh. They aroused the people to read them and not other books. That's why they're called Mikra, because they motivate them to read. Okay, I got to go now for another shiur. But interesting Yisodos, a lot to think about. We'll see if we want to finish this next time. I think I'm going to read it through and see if it's worth a full another shiur and see if we can find other stuff about it. But hopefully it was an interesting exercise. Yeah.
What was that mythology?
The 1993 Shavuos shiur on Masorah, which is allegedly the best Shavuos shiur Rebbe's ever given.
You posted